Tasha's Cauldron of Everything is right around the corner, and everyone's excited. As players, we're anxious to try out the new spells and class features and subclasses, and there are a few toys for us as DMs as well, including a whole section on puzzles. Now, I've been meaning to do a video on puzzles for a long time, because I feel like puzzles have a unique place inside the game. They force our players to stop and think. So we use them to break up the pace and switch tracks for a second, or to layer an extra dimension on an already existing D&D experience, like in combat. But what's puzzled me is how hard they are to get right. I'm sure you've noticed this. You try to put together a simple puzzle like the Pillar and Rune puzzle from Skyrim, but your players missed the fact that the pillars can turn, or they didn't see one of the runes, or they became convinced that the material the pillars were made out of was really important, so they started mapping out all the nearby quarries. They ended up hopelessly lost, confused, or frustrated. So it's a surprise to me that DMs get so little guidance on puzzles when they can be so tricky, and when they've been in the D&D canon for so long. But out of all the Dungeon Master guides, only the 4th edition handbook has a section on puzzles, and it's only a few pages long. Now, Tasha's is going to help with this, obviously, but I have my own experience. I've learned a lot, and I've done a lot of research that I'd like to share with you. So let this video be the missing D&D puzzle advice that's been absent from the Dungeon Master canon so far. Before we get started, let's set down some definitions first. What am I talking about when I'm talking about puzzles? Now, we all have an intuitive idea of what a puzzle is. We got jigsaws and Sudoku puzzles and mazes, but then there are the puzzles that you find inside of video games, like in Portal and The Legend of Zelda. These are puzzles too, just ones that are smoothly integrated into a larger experience. So what connects all of these things as puzzles? Well, game designer Jesse Schell describes puzzles as a game with a dominant strategy. That is to say, it is a problem-solving activity where the player's goal is to find the one solution that will always solve the problem. So, puzzles are a problem with one solution, and the fun comes from figuring out that one solution. And the key to keeping that process fun is good communication. Game design critic Josh Beiser puts it in a great way. Great puzzle design is about an unspoken contract between the designer and the player, with the assumption that the player is given all the information they need to solve it, and it's just a matter of parsing it out. Let's look at a Sudoku puzzle. This puzzle's goal is the same as every other Sudoku. You want to fill out the remainder of the grid with one number of each in every row, column, and grid section. So what strategy succeeds at this goal? Well, there's only the one. It's filling out the grid exactly like this. And it's the process of figuring out this one strategy, or solution, that engages us. So it's the puzzle's responsibility to show the player everything they need to know to solve it. What do you need to know to solve a puzzle? Well, you need to know the goal of the puzzle. You need to know what's in the way of getting to the goal. And you need to know all the tools you have at your disposal that can get you past what's in your way. In a standalone puzzle game like Sudoku, all of these things are made explicit for you. What's the goal? Well, it's right there in the rules. What's in my way? Well, some of these numbers are already filled in, so you can't just fill out the grid willy-nilly. And what are the tools I have at my disposal to get past what's in my way? Well, you still have these numbers. They give you the starting information you need to complete the puzzle, and you can continue to make deductions based on the rules of the puzzle. Keep in mind that just understanding a puzzle's rules and mechanics is a kind of tool. But in Dungeons & Dragons, like in most video games, we don't stop everything to announce, "Hey, you've arrived at a puzzle. Here are all the rules." We want our puzzles to be more smoothly integrated. We want it to feel like part of a larger experience. Now, video game designers have been grappling with this exact tension for a long time now, and they've developed some designer principles that translate very well into D&D. So, when we are designing puzzles in D&D, let us keep the following principles in mind. First, recognize that art is important. What an object looks like is going to tell you a lot about how it will behave. In Portal, the buttons and doors are connected by these glowing lines, which gives you an idea that they are literally connected in some way. And the fact that they use buttons is important too, because a button tells you immediately what you can do with it. You can push it. D&D is not a visual medium, but the idea remains the same. The objects that we use in our puzzles and the way we describe them suggest things to our players. So a well-written piece of boxed text or a handout, which can be visual, becomes especially important in scenes with puzzles. The next puzzle principle that video game designers can teach us is pretty critical. Give feedback on progress. Our players have to know, at least to some extent, which actions are getting them closer to their goal and which ones aren't. Look at this puzzle from Portal as an example. You have your one cube, and as soon as you place it on the button, the game immediately lets you know you're only halfway there. So where could a second cube... Aha! If your players aren't getting feedback on their actions, they're not solving a puzzle, they're playing a guessing game. Which is actually why you haven't heard me mention riddles up to this point. Riddles are the quintessential guessing game. They're not a puzzle. You ask a question, and the PCs give the right answer, or they don't. And if they don't, they can try another answer. It's either right, or it isn't. And they can guess again, and again, and again, never getting any closer to the right answer, because they have no idea how close their answer was when they last gave the wrong one. Now, you can turn a riddle into a puzzle by offering that kind of feedback. You can play hot or cold with your PCs, or play 20 questions. Then they feel like they're getting closer to a correct answer with every step, and they don't feel frustrated or lost. Feedback makes all the difference. But above all, game designers know the key to clear communication is elegance. Puzzles shouldn't confuse a player with red herrings or extraneous information. The best puzzles show a player only the tools they need to know to solve the puzzle and nothing else. And here's the rub. This is why puzzles are so hard to pull off in D&D, because your players are always bringing with them way more tools than any of your puzzles could ever use. In The Legend of Zelda, Link can't jump off walls to cross a gap, or pull out a 10-foot pole to push a distant button. There are limits to what you can do inside the game. The players know this, and that limits the possibilities they need to imagine for solutions to the puzzle. But in D&D, you don't have any limits. That's the whole point of D&D. If you can imagine it and it seems reasonable, then it's doable. If Link were in D&D, he could do all those things we just mentioned. And he's joined by 3 other Links, who can also do all the same things, and use all their spells, and their class features, and their feats, and their magic items, and so on. And even if your puzzle doesn't have anything to do with those things, your PCs are going to imagine solutions that involve those tools, because that's the toolbox they're coming to the puzzle with. It becomes easy for them to miss any new tools that you introduce and just try some weird shit because, hey, it might work. And they might unintentionally or intentionally break your puzzle or skip past it, but most likely they'll end up lost, confused, and frustrated. Put simply, the diversity of PC tools built into the game reduces elegance and muddies communication. So, how do we deal with this? Well, in a lot of ways we can't. We could try imposing elegance on our players by taking their tools away. Tell them, no, you can't cast teleport here, or no, the grappling hook won't work on that ledge, it's a special ledge. But that feels arbitrary, that's no fun for our players. Instead, we can make up for the lack of elegance by carefully considering the puzzle principles from earlier and further adapting them for D&D. Which is what I've done for this video, obviously. So, let's go through what I've found and unlock the way to smoothly integrated, intuitive, fun D&D puzzles. And as we discuss these D&D puzzle principles, I am going to be making a puzzle as an example of those principles in action. I'm going to try to adapt a Sudoku puzzle into my D&D game. So let's get right to it. I already have my goal for the puzzle. The PCs want to get to the prisoner inside the force cage here. And I have what's in the way, the force cage.
I want my Sudoku puzzle to be the way to power down the force cage and free the prisoner. I've also already decided that I don't want a full 9x9 Sudoku grid. That's going to be too much. I'm going to go all the way down to a 4x4 grid. Alright, let's apply some principles.
First, we want to construct our puzzle using objects and scenery that imply the mechanics our puzzle operates under. For my Sudoku puzzle, there's a lot of things I want to imply to the players, but the most important thing is I need them to understand that by solving the puzzle, by having one number of each in every row and column, they will break the barrier.
So my question becomes, how do I show that this gets rid of the barriers, but anything else does not? My idea is to fill the Sudoku grid with an incorrect solution at the start, and say that if the same number shows up in 2 adjacent spots on the grid, a glowing filament of power will appear between them, and these filaments are what power the force cage. The new goal of the puzzle, then, becomes to undo all these filaments without creating any new ones. This means that technically my puzzle is no longer a Sudoku, since some of our numbers can actually repeat within a row and still have no filaments, but for the moment at least I'm okay with this change. Worst case scenario, it makes the puzzle a little easier, which is only a good thing. My players also need to know that each space on the grid can only be set to one of 4 numbers. My idea is to make each space on the grid a floating tetrahedron. The side facing up determines what number is in the space. But it's also at this point that I decide instead of using numbers, I'm going to use 4 arcane glyphs to better integrate the puzzle into the fiction of the game. These magic glyphs have some kind of power that they generate when 2 are adjacent on the grid.
My first idea was actually to have one glyph that radiated a glow of 4 different elemental energies, and you could change the glow by striking it with a different element. But there's nothing about a magic glyph that implies that hitting it with energy makes it change its color. It's a magic glyph scrawled on the floor. It can do anything. Unlike a button or a switch, it didn't imply any way to play with it simply by existing as it is. And it certainly didn't imply the mechanic that I was looking for. So I changed it to 4 glyphs on the tetrahedrons that can move around.
Of course, we also need to show that some of these spaces can't be changed. But I think that's a simple fix. Instead of a tetrahedron on an unchanging square, we'll just put a pillar with a single glyph on it.
So that's a big one. How your puzzle presents itself guides your players so much at the beginning of a puzzle, which is why very often your puzzle will want handouts. Handouts allow your players to hold way more information in their head than they normally could, which is something you do a lot when solving puzzles. A handout can describe a complicated scene or object much more succinctly than text can, and very often a handout is the main way your players are going to be interacting with your puzzle. For our Sudoku puzzle, my handout is probably going to be just a recreation of this sketch, also on a whiteboard, so that I can update things as the PCs play with the puzzle. I'll probably also include a handout of the 4 symbols on their own. So we've adapted our first puzzle principle. Now it's time to move on to the second, giving feedback. And this will actually be less of an adaptation and more of a straightforward application, because just like in video games, we have to make sure it's apparent when the PCs are getting closer to their goal and when they are not.
At the moment, you might think our puzzle already does that. More filaments break when you get closer to the solution, and more appear when you have identical glyphs adjacent to one another. But actually, the players don't yet know that 0 filaments will take away the force cage. Not until they happen to break all of them, and by that time the puzzle is over. So instead of having the cage fall all at once at the end, is there a way to have it fall piece by piece over the course of the puzzle? What if the one force cage was actually 4 overlapping cages, each one tied to a glyph by a particular color? Now, as the PCs eliminate all the filaments of a single color, the same colored barrier falls, a clear indication that the prisoner is one step closer to being freed. And the colors also serve as a visual indicator that, yes, all these things are connected. You may notice that we still have a miniature version of our earlier problem. Players still need to break all the filaments of one color before they discover this is how the barriers fall, but we'll take care of that in a bit.
Now we're ready to grapple with elegance, and this is the real challenge. We don't want to take any of our players' tools away, but we can guide them towards the correct tools by using 2 main techniques: introducing mechanics slowly and having redundant information. By introducing mechanics slowly, we're trying to be as elegant as we can within the confines of D&D. If our players need to learn new tools to solve a puzzle, we only want to teach them 1 or 2 tools at a time, especially before we use them in complex ways. As such, I think that our puzzle could really use a prelude, a smaller, introductory puzzle that just gets the players used to the mechanics before they go on to the full-blown thing. If our puzzle is a kind of prison cell, then I think the prison entrance would be a good place to put this introductory puzzle.
This is what I came up with. The smallest grid possible, 2 by 2, and 2 of the spaces already set in stone. Literally. The filaments are glowing and there are a couple matching barriers. The puzzle has all the same elements of our main puzzle, but focused. There's less room for error or confusion, and fewer things to experiment with that might distract the players from discovering their tools.
It's short, it's sweet, it's elegant. Well, at least as elegant as it gets in D&D. The players are still going to enter this room with bucket loads of tools they don't need, and we can't filter out the noise of all those tools, but we can flood the players with clues leading them toward the tools they do need. In fact, this is another instance where Justin Alexander's 3-clue rule will help us out a lot. We first went over the 3-clue rule in my video on whodunits. And if you think about it, a whodunit is just a logic puzzle, stretched out over an entire adventure. But we'll save that for another time. The 3-clue rule is as follows. For any conclusion you want the PCs to make, include at least 3 clues. Now, when it comes to puzzles, the conclusions we want our PCs to make are an understanding of the puzzle's mechanics. So when we want to apply the 3-clue rule to our puzzles, we're going to want to first list out the mechanics that are necessary for our PCs to understand in order to solve the puzzle, and then we need to provide 3 clues for each mechanic within the puzzle itself. For the Sudoku puzzle, I reckon there are only 3 mechanics the PCs need to understand to solve it. That the filaments uphold the force barriers, that adjacent matching glyphs will create a filament, and that the tetrahedrons can move to display different glyphs. Now we just need to build 3 clues for each revelation. For Revelation 1, we've already suggested a connection between the filaments and the barriers by having them share colors, so we need to make 2 more. I wonder if we can set up our initial mini-puzzle in such a way that the players almost have to discover the connection between the filaments and the barriers.
What if instead of finding the glyphs set up like this when they arrive in the room, they're set up like this? Because the red barrier is already down, we create the possibility that a player will try to match red with red, seems reasonable, but will create the red barrier, which will immediately let them know the relationship between filaments and barriers, and it introduces some extra feedback into the puzzle. Obviously, more barriers is wrong, so matching things is bad.
For the 3rd clue, I'm just going to include a note that if the PCs mess with the filament of a particular color, the same colored barrier will shimmer, and vice versa. Just a little reinforcement of the connection between the 2 things if the PCs go poking around with either one. With that done, it's time for conclusion 2. Matching adjacent glyphs create filaments. The first couple of clues for this are already built into the puzzle. The initial setup of our mini-puzzle shows glyphs connected by filaments, and changing the orientation of tetrahedrons will make filaments appear and disappear. So what could the 3rd clue be?
I decided to carve an actual grid into the floor between the tetrahedrons. It suggests a relationship between all of these elements, and in a way where we understand why these 2 tetrahedrons would create a filament, but not these 2.
Alright, that's 2 revelations down. The only mechanic left for our PCs to understand is that they can turn the tetrahedrons to show a different glyph face up. Currently, the only thing that suggests that is the fact that there are other glyphs on the other faces of the tetrahedrons. But what if we added a magic glow to the top glyph? That suggests that the orientation of the tetrahedron does matter. I'm also going to add a clue in the boxed text. I'm going to describe the tetrahedrons as slowly bobbing in the air, which suggests that they're not rooted in place. And my 3rd clue will once again be something discovered by experimentation. I'll make a note that if a PC pokes or even moves too quickly past a tetrahedron, it will swivel in the air and turn about, thereby suggesting it can quite easily be moved, and moved purposefully.
And there we are, our finished puzzle and mini-puzzle, ready to be put in front of some players.
What started out as a straightforward adaptation of Sudoku has kind of become its own thing, with its own secondary mini-puzzle to introduce the mechanics. And what's really cool about this is we can imagine using those mechanics in all kinds of different ways now. What if we have a puzzle where some of the barriers block access to some of the tetrahedrons you need for other barriers? What if you put a combat in the middle of all these elements? You could fill a whole dungeon with glyphs and filaments and barriers and use them in all kinds of different ways. But as you do so, remember the puzzle principles we went over in this video. Plus one more. My ultimate D&D puzzle principle. Based on years of experience and reigning above all the rest, is this. Keep it easy. You might scoff at the idea that an easy puzzle will be any fun for your players, but keep in mind what a puzzle is for in D&D. We use them to break up the pace and switch tracks for a second. And in both those cases, we don't want the puzzle to take up too much space and get in the way. Or you might be concerned that an easy puzzle can quickly become trivial, especially with 4 players working on it at once. Now, that's not how that works, but still, it's better for a puzzle to be trivial and take up no time at all than to be too hard and take up too much time, because at a certain point, you might as well have stopped playing D&D and pulled out Picross. And speaking of keeping it easy, this sounds like a good place to talk about hints. Hints can be a controversial topic among DMs. Should we give hints for our puzzles? Well, hints certainly keep things easy. Jesse Shell is all for hints, and even for giving the answer away. Plenty of video games include hint buttons. In D&D, a common tactic is to allow a PC to make an intelligence check to receive a hint about a puzzle. I like this idea, but I think at my table, I wouldn't even require the check. If we're committed to giving our PCs hints, we shouldn't gate them behind a check, which has a chance to fail. Instead, we should just give them a hint as they ask for it. Or better yet, we should prepare several hints ahead of time and think about the ways in which we might dole them out. For example, we might think that anytime a magic user needs a hint, we have a few magic user hints prepared. Magic users can tell that the glyphs are active when they are face up, or that the filaments and the barriers have a certain magical energy resonance that a magic user can just feel if they're looking for it. That kind of thing. It's a controversial take maybe, but I am pro hints. Okay, almost time to wrap up, but before we do, 2 quick warnings for you. Warning number 1, even after all of this work, your players will still occasionally try to break or skip your puzzle. My advice is to let them. If your puzzle is well integrated into the larger game, then it's never going to have only your solution, nor should it. That's antithetical to D&D's premise. Even our apparently one-solution Sudoku puzzle doesn't really only have one solution. What if a player casts Disintegrate at one of the force barriers? What if they cast Stone Shape to go underneath one of the barriers? It's fun to think of ways to circumvent puzzles that your DM hadn't thought of. So my advice is, let them have their fun. And let them use up those precious spell slots along the way. My other warning is this. More than in a lot of other D&D related design, you're going to mess this up. And a big part of that is because ordinarily you can't playtest something before you put it in front of your players. And playtesting is normally an essential part of puzzle design. I mean, the Sudoku puzzle that we went over, that didn't come out of my head whole cloth like I presented it in the video. I had to playtest that thing 3 different times with major changes each time in the research for this video. And I'm sure the next time I put that in front of my players, I'm going to discover something else about it that's lacking. I mean, I hope it's a small thing. It'd be very embarrassing for me otherwise. The good news is that you'll get better the more you try, and these principles will help you avoid the big missteps. You'll be fine as long as you keep these principles in mind. Remember to treat each puzzle as its own thing, and never forget to wear your game designer hat. But of course, that's true for everything we do in Adventure Prep. Really, if you aren't looking to flex those particular design muscles, and I don't blame you if you're not, it would be easier to find someone else who's done all the hard work and playtesting for you. So I guess it's a good thing that Tasha's Cauldron of Everything is coming with a bunch of puzzles ready built for you to drop into your campaign. One more thing to look forward to. And while we wait, you can have the puzzle that we worked on in this video. I have put that puzzle and another puzzle that I worked on while doing research for this video into a PDF, which you can get right now. There's a link in the description. It's free, but it is also pay what you want in case you liked what you saw and you wanted to throw some support my way. This was my most ambitious video yet. I hope you learned a lot from it. I know I did in the course of making it. I hope you can take what you've learned, bring it into your next game. I know I'm excited to take what I've learned and bring it into my next video. And I will see you there.